Well, happy Easter, everyone. I'm going to be finally getting back to my response to Emma Thorne's very interesting video about Bible contradictions. And I'm going to be covering the section that she dedicates to the way the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is treated by the four Gospels.
Let's spice things up again by talking about Jesus' death and resurrection. This particular narrative is invaluable in this discussion, not just because it appears in four Gospels that we can compare and contrast, but because it is also the cornerstone of the Christian faith. As a result, this part of the Jesus story is subject to my particular pet peeve that I mentioned earlier, the combining of all four Gospels into one story.
Yeah, this story is absolutely central to the Christian faith, to our whole way of seeing the world, seeing how God is working in the world, and what the plan is for the entire creation. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these are eyewitness accounts. That is something that is made very clear in the New Testament itself, that these are eyewitness accounts, be it of the transfiguration of Jesus, of his baptism, and then, as we're going to be talking about here, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. These are not taken by Christians as being fictions. These are not parables. These are eyewitness accounts of a very real central event that took place. So we can and should read them as separate accounts as they were recorded, but it also does make sense to try to put them together to understand in even greater detail the central story, using the different eyewitness accounts to strengthen the narrative and strengthen our understanding of the original story.
This is so common in church, in children's books, and it makes the story incomprehensible. It completely changes, even wipes out the narrative direction of each individual story, changing the character of Jesus in every story to become something inherently contradictory, because he behaves differently in each telling, because each author was trying to say something different about him.
Well, look, to be fair to Emma here, I do agree that people should read the original story from the Bible itself. I started reading the Bible for myself on my own at the age of 6, I think, and there are a lot of children in a similar situation to me, and it was being read to me from an even younger age. We don't have to force simplified paraphrases onto children and say, no, you get these extremely toned down, edited versions of the Bible, that's all that you can handle. The same goes for adults with these movies and TV shows. You know, it's not a replacement for reading the Bible itself. We don't have to have someone else showing us the Bible through a art form. That being said, these things aren't wrong, and the reason for doing them aren't wrong. The authors of the Bible were telling their perspective on a real story, something I think Emma disagrees with here. I think she assumes that these authors are simply trying to get some kind of a message across to the readers and are using this Jesus story, which is not entirely true, to get that message across. The way that Christians see it is that they were eyewitnesses to, or talked to eyewitnesses to, very real events that changed the world forever and had to be recorded because there was just a handful of people, a few dozen in sort of inner circle, a few hundred if you're talking about maybe the greater body of disciples. Just a few hundred people max in total who were witness to these events. And it was important for these people to tell their stories and get them into writing. That's what the Gospels are, and that's why it's not wrong to put them together. Even sometimes when we try to simplify them and turn them into a children's story, it may not always be as necessary as we put emphasis on. The Christian publishing industry is very bloated, and it's not all necessary. We can do a lot more to just read from the Bible than we do. But the idea behind making those compilations, making those harmonizations is not wrong and is not inconsistent with what the authors of the Bible were trying to do.
If you've been around my channel for a while, you might know that Mark is my favourite gospel. I think it's the most interesting version of the story and key to the narrative differences between the four Gospels is the ending of Mark. It ends with the women fleeing the tomb and saying nothing to anyone. It's pretty abrupt and leaves you wondering, how are we reading about it now?
I wish she would have expounded a bit more on what the short version of Mark 16 actually contains. Yeah, we're going to get into now a bit about the long versus short versions of Mark chapter 16. In the short version, which ends with verse 8, the women have been made aware of the resurrection. They've gone into the empty tomb, they've talked with an angel, and they are on their way to tell the disciples about the resurrection. It's not as if they're just running off from the tomb and that's it. No, they have learned about the resurrection and they are on their way to tell the disciples about the resurrection and to tell the disciples what they're to do next, what Jesus wants them to do next. And that's where the short version of Mark 16 ends. And I think it would have made sense for Emma to have mentioned that. I know the way that some skeptics like to use the short version is to try to give the impression that the original tellings of the gospel did not include the resurrection, but that is not the case. I'm not sure if that is what Emma is doing here, but I have read other skeptics try to use it in that way.
Later scribes added a little addendum to kind of fix it up and make it gel with the other Gospels, in which Jesus reappears to his disciples and tells them to preach the gospel. This isn't always included in the Bible, since it's largely accepted to be not original. If it does appear, it tends to have a little note that says, this is likely added by later scribes.
Okay, I really don't like her treatment of this topic. I have not found a Bible translation that omits the longer version of Mark 16. If such a Bible exists, I wish she could have at least cited it, which translations leave it out. Yes, a lot of Bibles have notes that do tell the reader that some early manuscripts didn't have those later verses, but as far as I know, every and any mainstream translation, certainly the top 5-10 translations that are used, include the long version of Mark 16. And it's not entirely accepted that that longer version wasn't original. It's a big topic, and I wish she would have been more cautious with it. The truth is that of the well over 1,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, almost every single one, I think all but 3 of them, have the long version of Mark. So it would make sense to try to understand why there are 3 manuscripts that have the short version, and also try to understand why the earliest Christian writers, whose writings go way back before even our earliest manuscripts, they cite the longer version of Mark 16. So it's not a clear-cut case of this is how it was and then this was added on later. There is a discussion around it, and I wish she had been more careful with the topic. I'm not going to go into it anymore, but it's a very interesting topic, and I would encourage you to look into it.
Some other fun differences. In each Gospel, a different selection of people first discovers the empty tomb. Matthew and Mark place 1 angel at the scene. Luke and John place 2. John says that Jesus refused to be held or touched. In Matthew, the women clasp Jesus' feet. And in Luke, the risen Jesus invites his followers to touch him to prove that he's not a ghost. Come on, bro. Touch me. See? Look at that. Real as shit, dude. That's not what he says.
Okay, she says a lot there, and I'm going to take issue with 2 of the points that she makes about who discovers the empty tomb first. When she said that each gospel has different people discovering the empty tomb, I did kind of a double take there, and I thought, gosh, I got to go back and look at this. But no, they're pretty consistent there. Each one of them has Mary Magdalene discovering the empty tomb. In the 3 synoptics, it's Mary Magdalene as part of a group of other women, and it names a lot of them. So I don't think that's a contradiction. You know, each of the 4 gospels have Mary Magdalene discovering the empty tomb. The 3 synoptics tell us about some of her companions during that event. And then on the touching versus not touching, this one bugs me. I don't think Emma really did her homework there. It looks to me, when I hear stuff like this, that some of these points she maybe just got from one of those lists and didn't really look into it. In John, Jesus tells Mary, "Don't touch me." But then later on, he invites his disciple Thomas to touch him. And that same event is talked about in Luke, where he appears to them and asks his disciples to touch him, to see that he's real. It's a different perspective on when he invites Thomas to touch him. So, and then of course we hear in Matthew, Jesus meeting these women on the road, and they grab his feet or something like that. So these aren't contradictory. If we're going to say that John is contradicting the others, then we have to say that John is contradicting himself. Maybe John was just like monkey on a typewriter type thing, didn't know what he was saying from one verse to the next. Or we could maybe take a more logical approach and say that at one point in Jesus' resurrection, he had an interaction where he said one thing, and then at another point, he said another thing, and with different people, different things happened, and I don't think that's problematic.
In Matthew, Jesus appears to the women on their way to tell the other disciples that the tomb is empty. In Mark, he doesn't appear at all. In Luke, Jesus appears to 2 followers on the road to Emmaus, and then to his disciples.
So in John, Mark, and Matthew, we are specifically told that Jesus first appeared to Mary and some of the other women who visited the tomb. John and Mark tell us that the first was Mary. Matthew has it as being a group of women who encounter Jesus as they're going away from the tomb. Luke tells us about the story of 2 disciples meeting Jesus on the road to Emmaus. But that same story is also told in Mark, and we learn in Mark that that happened after Jesus had appeared to Mary. So there aren't contradictions there. The Gospels agree that the first people to see Jesus were those women who visited the tomb. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I had originally intended to go on a bit more, as after this, Emma does get into some of the seeming discrepancies surrounding Jesus' death, but I want to finish up this video, get it online. I think it's important to realize that the New Testament tells us that these are eyewitness accounts, and that is how Christians understand the tellings in those 4 Gospels. So in that context, it does make sense to try to harmonize them. It also makes a lot of sense to read them separately and not worry about the differences, understanding that people who are seeing something as astonishing, as paradigm shifting as the resurrection, they are going to have been hit with so much information, visual, audible, hearing about the events from others, that there should be differences in the tellings. Thankfully, we have 4 very rich tellings of that story, and they do not contradict each other. Okay, well, Emma does do more. I may get back to her video later. Once again, I do appreciate what she's done in bringing up these points. I think that a lot of what she is doing is in good faith, and I hope that she and others like her will take it a bit further and try to believe. If you really want to get what the authors were intending to put across, then belief is a huge part of it. It's an indispensable part of it. So I hope that people can more and more read these passages from a point of view of belief, or at least attempted belief, as that is what the authors are trying to share with us. Well, thanks again for watching, and happy Easter.